Okay, hey everyone, it's Coop. As you know, for the last month and a half, I've been running for Douglas County District Attorney. And a big part of my platform as your DA is going to be ending the failed war on drugs in Douglas County. As a defense attorney, I've seen just how poorly the war on drugs has treated individuals in our criminal justice system and how it hasn't made our community safer, and it's actually destabilized lots of populations all over the country. And a big part of the war on drugs has to do with, law enforcement. They're a big role in that. They're the ones that are the first point of contact with a lot of charged with drug crimes. And so a big thing that I want to do here in Douglas County is get law enforcement involved in helping us stop putting people in jail and in prisons for drugs. And so I'm really honored actually today to be talking to someone who I really respect, Neill Franklin. Neill is a big proponent on ending the war on drugs, and he has some really personal reasons for doing that. I'm going to give you just kind of a brief summary off of Neill's website, the Law Enforcement Action Project Partnership.org, about who Neill is, and then we're going to talk to him about just how we can be part of the solution in ending the war on drugs. Neill's a 34-year law enforcement veteran of the Maryland State Police and the Baltimore Police Department. After 23 years of dedicated service in Maryland State Police, he was recruited in 2000 by the Commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department to reconstruct and command Baltimore's Education and Training Section. During his time on the force, he held the position of Commander for the Education and Training Division in the Bureau of Drug and Criminal Enforcement. He also instituted and oversaw the very first domestic violence investigative units for the narcotics agent with the Maryland State Police. Major Franklin was persuaded by then Mayor of Baltimore, Kurt Schmoke, who declared that the war on drugs was counterproductive and created excessive violence. This was followed by the tragic murder of his close friend, Corporal Ed Toadley, while making a drug bias from the failed drug war policies. And he retired from policing in 2010 and started leading the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. So Neill is somebody who has an extensive background in law enforcement and in criminal justice reform, in dealing with issues that affects people in the war on drugs. And so, Neill, I'm really honored to have you talking with us today in Conversations with Coop. Thanks for being with us.
Well, Coop, I want to thank you for having me on this little interview here. This is what we do in the Law Enforcement Action Partnership as a collection of law enforcement speakers across, not just across the country, we're international. And sometimes I forget to mention that. We have a very strong branch in Europe, headquartered in the UK. But most of our work is done here in the United States because, unfortunately, we are I guess you could say, the cornerstone for the war on drugs. This is where it really began, going back 5 decades or more. So, yeah, this is what we do at the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. And if you don't mind, I'll begin real quick with picking up on what the synopsis that you just gave of my background. There are a couple more pieces I want to fill in here and there regarding my journey to this place where I'm at now and advocating for an end to the war on drugs and why.
Sure.
So just real quick, you mentioned that I retired from the Maryland State Police, which I did. I think about it, it's been 2 decades now that I retired from there. And when I was with the Maryland State Police, I was right in the middle of the war on drugs. And when I say the war on drugs, right now I'm talking about what Richard Nixon launched back in the 1970s, even though we know drug prohibition started way before then with people like Harry Anslinger, who folks consider to be the nation's first drug czar. He was in charge of the Bureau of Narcotics going back to the 1930s, coming forward after alcohol prohibition into the 1940s and so on. But anyway, beginning with Richard Nixon, because I started in policing in the late 70s. And literally within a year after starting with the Maryland State Police, I went into narcotics, working undercover, mainly in the Washington, D.C. suburbs in the state of Maryland. But I also did a lot of work in Baltimore City, in the city in which I grew up. So after working undercover, and I want to say this, most of the arrests that I made by far were for simple marijuana possession. And the reason for that is not that we had this axe to grind against people who use marijuana. The thing is that it was the easiest arrest to make because of the odor of it. Okay, you could smell it. It gave you probable cause to stop and search someone, to detain them temporarily, and it usually ended up in an arrest. Now, the reason for that is because we wanted to be able to apply pressure to people, to use them as informants. Okay, nobody wants to go to jail. Nobody wants to end up in prison, and so we threaten them with that, and we squeeze information out of it. One thing we failed to realize is that most of the information that we got wasn't true information. People would tell us anything in order to, not go into our jails and our prisons. So, But so I worked undercover. I then quickly went into management, ended up supervising drug task forces in the state of Maryland. And we had one literally per county in our 23 counties in the state of Maryland. And at one time, I had 7 for the western part of the state, and then I had 9 for the eastern part of the state. But I kept going in and out of narcotics enforcement. And then at one time, I was in charge of the Northeast region for the Bureau of Drug and Criminal Enforcement. But the point I'm making, during all this time, I had no idea of the damage that we were doing to our country and arresting so many citizens in this country, which was supposed to be the land of the free. But it was the war on drugs that took us to this place of mass incarceration, to where we became the #1 incarcerator on the globe.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine it, not just in rate of incarceration, but in raw numbers, reaching 2.3 million people being locked up in this country, again, the land of the free. A rate higher than China, a rate higher than third world countries that we criticize for their human rights violations. And here we are locking up more people than any other country. So these are the things that I didn't realize. I didn't realize that we were attempting to solve a public health crisis with criminal justice strategies, and it just doesn't work. What other public health issue do we use our criminal justice system, and to resolve a public health issue? There are none. So anyway, going forward, when I retired, and even before I retired, I did get a little glimpse here and there of us heading in the wrong direction with our drug policy. And as you mentioned, it was Kurt Schmoke, who was the mayor of Baltimore City at that time, who literally, and this is what a lot of people don't know, before Kurt Schmoke became the mayor of Baltimore City, he was the city's prosecutor. And in the 1980s, this is where our paths initially crossed. When he was a prosecutor, there was an undercover narcotics detective named Marty Ward in Baltimore City. And he was working undercover, he was making a drug buy, and he was shot in the process in an apartment. Mayor Schmoke had to listen to the recording, actually listen to Marty dying on tape. And it's then that he started to pay attention to the violence that followed the illicit drug trade. And then shortly after that, he became mayor. And now he started seeing the health impacts of the war on drugs, accelerated overdose deaths, HIV with intravenous drug users, and the spread of that in Baltimore City. So now he decided to speak out about the failures of the war on drugs from a health perspective and from a violence perspective. When I left the state police and started working for Baltimore City, as you mentioned, a friend of mine, Ed Totley, was killed in a similar circumstance as Marty Ward when he was undercover agent with the Maryland State Police. And he was a good friend. So he died in a similar circumstance. And that made me pause for a moment and question the violence surrounding the drug trade. Shortly after Ed Totley was killed and a couple other Baltimore City officers were killed, We then had a family of 7, Coop, a family of 7, the Dawson family in Baltimore City, who was killed by one drug dealer in one night. Mother,
Yeah.
father, 5 kids. The mother was working with the police to get this drug dealer and his crew arrested from selling drugs in front of their house. He found out that she was working with us, the police, decided to send a message, and he set their home on fire in the middle of the night and killed the entire family.
Wow.
It was at that point where I started publicly speaking about the failures of our drug policy from a place of violence. And I reflected back on alcohol prohibition and what I knew about alcohol prohibition, tied the two together regarding prohibition policies and the fact that they don't work, especially when you're trying to solve a public health issue.
Yeah.
And that was the beginning of my journey. It was just a couple years after that that I stumbled across LEAP's new website. So go back to like 2002, LEAP had just put its website on the internet. I don't know how old your listeners are or viewers of this interview are, but in 2002, most websites were just text, just a lot of words. But anyway, I was looking for some law enforcement folks who were thinking along the same lines as me, because there's comfort in those numbers. And I reached out to them, started communicating with them, and I was still in policing. I then left the Baltimore Police Department and went to Maryland Transit. But I actually started speaking for LEAP while I was still a commander with the police department, and eventually became the executive director of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. Back then, the name of the organization was Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, and I became the executive director in 2010. Okay. So that's a little bit of my journey, and I'll pause here for a moment, and then I'll just talk a little bit about what we do in LEAP as a collection of law enforcement folks.
Well, Neill, it sounds like you have a very intimate sort of backstory when it comes to dealing with, how the war on drugs has affected both people in the community of Baltimore and law enforcement officers. Now, I mean, the reason I value this conversation is because you come from a law enforcement officer perspective, and I want to ask you a little bit about that. Do you find that in law enforcement in general, this idea that, the war on drugs and, how it's being prosecuted and how it's being waged is something that's a losing battle? Is that a perspective that we're starting to see more and more frequently around the country?
Yeah, so let me first say it's not a losing battle. We could never win it in the first place. We never had a chance of winning it. It was lost from day one. And again, that's going back 100 years. As I mentioned earlier, drug prohibition really started in the early 1900s, with some of the first laws, one of them being a law against the possession of opium just for Chinese. Mm-hmm. What a lot of people also don't realize is that our drug policies are primarily based upon culture and race, not upon solving a drug abuse problem in this country. So I encourage your listeners, we're not going to get into the history of it here on our conversation, but I encourage your viewers to do their diligence in researching drug policy in this country. And I'll mention one book, and that is Chasing the Scream by Johan Hari, who has done extensive research on the history of drug policy in this country and wrote a really poignant book. So I encourage your folks to view that.
Sure.
Law enforcement in this country, unfortunately, has been hoodwinked into believing that we could be effective in curing our drug abuse problem in this country through criminal justice policies. That's what I believe. That's what many cops still believe, unfortunately. Our police leaders in this country, unfortunately, work from a place of politics. So whatever the political leaders in your community decided they want to do, whether it's this tough on crime approach, zero tolerance policing, that's what your police chiefs are going to do. They're going to follow that, because if they don't, they get fired. Sheriffs tend to be a little different. If you are a sheriff of an educated community, that's a community that does its own research, where the people make up their own individual minds about what is effective and what is not, what works, what doesn't work. If you're a sheriff of such a community, then you probably have, I guess because you're elected by the people, you probably have a good perspective about the failures of the war on drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a few sheriffs across the country of communities like that, and they are like, what? No, we're done with the prohibition of marijuana in this county, okay? Because it doesn't work, it never worked. But if you're the sheriff of a jurisdiction or a county where people still just don't get it, then you're going to do whatever the electorate wants you to do, even though you may see things differently. But let me say this, it was a little bit about leadership. Let me talk about the men and women on the streets who are actually doing the work. They don't, for the most part, now I'm not saying all, but for the most part, they really don't want any part of being the so-called public health answer to this drug abuse problem. We've been very effective, LEAP, when I say we've been very effective in educating a lot of our police officers at the street level. And, they understand the challenges of the people in many of these communities. They understand the challenges, for instance, with the homeless population, where many of them have a codependency problem. So they're dealing with maybe alcohol abuse, they're dealing with drug abuse, and obviously they're dealing with homelessness, and they're dealing with some economic issues and mental health issues as well. That's a whole nother area. And the duality of mental health and substance abuse. But they get it because they see the challenges that these people are going through every day. They don't want to be arresting people. They'd rather be able to guide someone into the capable hands of a mental health professional or treatment professional or counselor. Because they know that if they can get someone treatment, then most likely they're not going to see that person the next day or the next week or the next month. But when they arrest someone, they know that they come back out, they arrest them again, they come back out, they arrest them again, they come back out, and they'd rather be focusing on people who are actually hurting other people, the rapists, the pedophiles that we have within our communities and neighborhoods, people committing robberies. And they also understand that the vast majority of our robberies are being committed by people who have substance abuse issues, because our policies our drug policies in this country isolate people. They isolate people by criminalizing them. They isolate people by the way of stigma. They isolate people by locking them out of employment opportunities, which keep them in this place of deprivation when it comes to economic and being able to support themselves and their families. And when you isolate people, you keep them in this place of criminality. And the only way that they believe that they can support their habits is to prey upon other people by robbing them, burglaries, stealing from stores, and so on. So the men and women on the street understand the challenges, and they'd rather see us as a community take a different approach to resolving or dealing with our drug abuse problem.
So it sounds like there are things that we can do, that our leaders can do in the community to make sure that our law enforcement officers on the street level, that it's a better use of resources for them to be able to divert their attention to the crimes that are actually harming our community, as opposed to spending their time locking people up for drugs. And one big policy that I have as DA, that I will have, when I'm DA, is that I'm going to treat the war on drugs, I'm going to end it here in Douglas County. What I'm going to treat it as, like you said, is a public health crisis. And that to me starts from the very beginning, when a law enforcement officer is forced to interact with somebody who might be addicted, who might have a substance abuse problem, and knowing how to see those signs and having some place to divert that person to other than to the court system. Because you mentioned some stats earlier, just about how destructive the war on drugs has been to our country and to our local communities. And I'm just going to read some stats, that I think are just mind blowing, which are that every 25 seconds in the United States, someone is arrested for some form of drug possession. We see 1/5 of the incarcerated population total in this country is serving time for a drug charge. And there's another 1.15 million people on probation or parole for drug-related offenses. And those numbers, to me, are just staggering. It's way too high. Those are numbers that I see as leading to obviously huge financial strain and resource strain on our system. And my goal as DA here in Douglas County is to divert almost every single drug case I see away from the criminal justice system and utilize things that I've heard from law enforcement officers just like yourself about how their resources can better be served actually keeping the community safe. So one thing I want to ask you about, Neill, is in the Law Enforcement Action Project, obviously you are a criminal justice reform minded group. Have you seen specifically other jurisdictions or other areas, parts of the country where this sort of approach has been used and it's successful? And when we talk about treating the war, the war on drugs like a public health crisis and not a war at all, have you seen that be able to put in action in other places, and can it work?
Yeah, sure. So Coop, let me talk about give you a couple examples. Actually, this morning I was on the phone with 2 police chiefs from the state of Massachusetts, from East Bridgewater and from Plymouth, Massachusetts. The chief I was talking to from East Bridgewater, he just recently retired, but the chief in Plymouth, he's still there. Now, Massachusetts is a state that has been and still is pretty much ahead of other states when it comes to harm reduction efforts for people who are using drugs. So we were talking about deflection. We were talking about some of the programs they put in place in these counties in the state of Massachusetts with these police departments, where people can come into the police departments and literally just say, I need help. And the reason, for police departments to be able to guide people and bring people in, because if someone decides at 2:30 in the morning that they need help because they're dealing with a substance abuse issue, they have to be able to seek that help right away. Mm-hmm. And police departments are open. We're open 24/7, right? This is also something that we'd like to, make happen within our emergency rooms. But have you ever been to an emergency room recently at a hospital? Mm-hmm. Even if you're dealing with a severe injury, it could take you hours before you're seen. But by going to a police department for, under this umbrella of deflection, right away you meet with someone. And in some cases, it's actually been the police chief who came in and would sit down with folks and say, okay, what are you dealing with? You can turn in any drugs or any works that you have. And none of this is a criminal process. It's about getting you immediately into the hands of treatment providers, counselors, whatever that need would be to help you begin traveling down that road of recovery. So just this morning, I was on the phone with 2 police chiefs talking about that. The formal name for this type of deflection program is called PARI, Police Addiction Recovery Initiative. I left out one word, but for the most part, that's what it is. Other forms, there's another program called Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion. Now, unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, people who are dealing with substance abuse many times commit crimes. Many of them are homeless. They may be trespassing. They may be doing some other things. Maybe it's some minor shoplifting or something like that. So Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion, which began in the city of Seattle in Washington State a few years ago, provides a way that if police officers arrest someone for a minor crime, they can then turn them over to treatment providers. There's a program set up where they can get them right into treatment, right into counseling. And it's in concert with that local prosecutor. So literally police and the prosecutor come together and say, hey, we have this person who the the cornerstone of their problem is substance abuse. So let's get them the help that they need. Let's show some compassion, get them the help that they need, which will then keep them out of this place of criminality and, hopefully resolve their problems. Those are two examples of how law enforcement is changing their perspective, changing their way and how they deal with this, as far as prosecutors go, as far as the police go. Many people are familiar with drug courts. I guess they have their place, but I don't really have a lot of confidence in drug courts. And first of all, I think there's a way to deal with maybe 80 to 90% of folks who come into our system without even getting them into court. Okay, let's deflect and defer people even before that happens. And we're starting to see that happen across the country. We just need the willingness to do it. And I'll say this, it's a whole lot cheaper, Coop. Depending upon where you are in this country, $35,000 to $50,000 a year to incarcerate someone.
Yeah.
To treat someone, depending upon where you are in the country, could be $5,000 to $20,000 tops a year. Economically, it's a smart thing to do. If we're serious about really taking care of people and families, it's a smart thing to do. And let's talk about public safety. We know that every time we arrest someone, I'm not talking about charging them with a crime. I'm not talking about convicting them of a crime. I'm not talking about putting them in corrections. I'm talking about an arrest, period, where you have probable cause to arrest someone. The arrest alone will put someone in a condition of unemployment. If you are employed and you're arrested, by the time you get out of the detention center, you may have lost your job because you couldn't show up for work the next day.
Yeah.
And what happens to the family? And if you're arrested in most states across this country, that becomes, that's accessible, it's public information. And if you go to apply for a job, I'm your prospective employer. I run your name through an online database. I see that you've been arrested for the possession of marijuana. I'm not even going to say anything to you. I'm going to overlook you and go right to the next candidate. People have to understand the impact of someone being arrested. And we're still arresting about 600,000 people every year in this country just for marijuana possession alone.
Yeah. And Neill, those things you speak about right now, as a defense attorney, somebody who's part of this system and in this system and sees it every day, I see those things you're talking about in our system here in Douglas County. I've seen moms arrested in front of their kids for marijuana, taken out of their homes, kids removed from homes because of moms getting arrested because of marijuana, thrown in jail. I've seen personally what it does to families for people to be locked up for these types of offenses. And I think that what you said really is something that, I'm really passionate about, which is the idea that just by the very virtue of arresting somebody in our system and, having law enforcement interact with them and bringing them into the system, it destabilizes that person's family. It destabilizes communities. A big role of a DA, of a prosecutor, in my opinion, is deflecting and diverting those people from the court system altogether. You talked about drug courts. In my opinion, and it's statistically, it's bared out that the word court with anything drug related doesn't work. The idea that the drug problem can be solved by our court system, I think we've seen that. It's not a good idea. It's not something that works. And so my role as DA is to use law enforcement who want to see these cases not go to court because they don't want to have to come in and testify on these cases and waste their time and the resources they have. Use them right there at that street level that I divert and deflect these cases. And we have those resources available. And like you said, the economic costs of that disparity that you mentioned between $30,000 and $50,000 a year to incarcerate somebody in a local county jail. I think that's an accurate number. And then probably 5 to 10 to treat that same person. I mean, that economic cost alone should be something that our leaders are taking into account when we're acknowledging that the war on drugs has failed. I think since 1971, I'm reading here, the United States the war on drugs has cost the United States an estimated $1 trillion. I mean, that is money that could go to treatment programs. That's money that could go to schools. That's money that could go to social services, all so we can keep fighting a losing battle. And so, Neill, I think everything you're talking about these are just based off of facts. This is based off of facts, and obviously your own personal observations, which are, you have, like I said, an intimate connection to this through your work in law enforcement. So I think I want to wrap up here by just, I want you to kind of tell, our viewers and listeners about your organization and what y'all are doing right now, in relation to this issue, and, where they can maybe go to learn more about your organization.
Okay, so first, in case your viewers want to do it while I'm wrapping this up, they can go to lawenforcementaction.org. That's lawenforcementaction.org. Our website is just full of information. Look at our 5 pillars of work, and I guarantee you it will blow your mind when you see the work that we're doing in this community of law enforcement. So what we do within the partnership, we are primarily a speakers bureau. Although we have thousands of members around the globe, we have a very key group of folks, just under 300, who are the official speakers for the organizations. And you'll be able to see their resumes on the website. You'll be able to search your state, see who we have in your state, and you'll be able to pull up their resumes. What we do as an organization, we go to conferences, we speak to community groups, we speak at colleges and universities across the country. We do webinars. Obviously, we're doing a lot of webinars right now because of COVID-19, and we're not doing in-person work. But we write op-eds, we write publications, anything that we have to do to educate people on a better way of, on how to improve the many systems within the criminal justice system, because there are many pieces, moving pieces within the criminal justice system. That's why we're a collection of police, prosecutors, judges, corrections officials, federal agents, and more, because we want to be able to show and work on these issues from every criminal justice perspective. When I say that, I mean like boots on the ground. The example of that is police are typically the ones that come in contact first with our citizens. Unfortunately, if someone is arrested, they then go before the prosecutor's office. Once they get to the prosecutor's office, they may proceed with a trial. And now you're before the bench in a courtroom and a judge. And unfortunately, if you're convicted, you end up in the Division of Corrections, and then out the back end with parole and probation. So as we work on these individual issues, we want a collection of all of these folks in solving the problem. And we also partner with community organizations at a national scale, as well as all the way down to your local grassroots organizations. So we don't work on improving our criminal justice system in isolation of law enforcement and judicial system. We bring in community members to work with us as well, because that's what this is all about. So that's what we do. If you want one of our speakers to, well, hopefully after this COVID-19 issue is over, to come and speak to any one of your groups, we speak to your policymakers, your legislators at the state, local, level, and federal levels as well, working on policy. But I want to say something real quick in wrapping this up. Number one, the importance of prosecutors in this. In every jurisdiction across this country, the most important person when it comes to our criminal justice system is the prosecutor. Because even though the police make an arrest, it is the prosecutor who decides whether that arrest goes before our courts or not, and who can take a really good look at that case and make some really good, valuable decisions. So extremely important. I want people to think about what's happening right now with our response to COVID-19 from the law enforcement community. Because the police are practicing social distancing, all right, in this country, every week we're making tens of thousands of fewer arrests for low-level offenses like drug possession, because we're not having that interaction with people. And you know what? public safety is not suffering because of that. Understand that. Public safety is not suffering because of that. Things are improving because we're not introducing so many people into our criminal justice system, which is like a black hole in space. Once you get in, it's very, very difficult, and for some people, impossible to get out of, right? That's a good thing. And we're working on improving public safety at the same time. So it's a demonstration that we can go about our work in criminal justice in this country without arresting so many people and still keep people safe. So hopefully we'll learn something from this going forward as we come out of our social distancing, as we get back to some sort of normalcy. Hopefully we won't return to zero tolerance policing. Hopefully we'll end up with a new way of working within the criminal justice system. And again, Coop, I thank you for the opportunity to be, to have this interview with you. And I thank you for your perspective on this as well, because prosecutors across this country are finally getting it. And we have a few prosecutors in Maryland. There are quite a few in the Northeast, out West, in the Midwest, and Illinois, who are really getting it, that we need to make the changes that you're speaking about. So again, I thank you for that. And what can I say?
Yeah.
Good
well,
work.
Neill, thank you. And it was an honor and a privilege to be able to talk to you from the perspective of a decorated law enforcement officer who knows what the war on drugs has done to communities and who's fighting to change it and to repair the harm that's been done. And so it was an honor and a privilege. I encourage everybody out there to go to Neill's organization's website. Once again, that's lawenforcementaction.org. You can learn so much about our failed war on drugs and all the good things that people are doing to repair the harm from this war on drugs. And so, Neill, I really thank you. It was a pleasure and a privilege. I also tell everybody out there, go to votecoop.com, where you can learn specifically about my policies and my platform to end the war on drugs here in Douglas County and to fix the broken system. So, Neill, thanks again. Thanks obviously for appearing, and thank you for all the work that you've done, and it was an honor.
Yeah. Thanks again, Coop.
All right.